Valeria Piñeiro is a Senior Research Coordinator in the Markets, Trade, and Institutions Division of the International Food Policy Research Institute. It was headquartered in Washington, D.C. Valeria received her Ph.D. in Agricultural Economics from the University of Maryland, and I think still does some teaching there. Her research interests include international trade, development strategies and economic growth, growth linkages, and regional dynamics. She has significant experience working in the areas of economic development and growth using general equilibrium models as the analytical tool, and has for the last several years led courses in many countries, teaching the theory and application of CGE models. And I would just make a plug in case she doesn't, is that her institute, the International Food Policy Research Institute, is really doing a fantastic job and has almost, from February, I think, in pulling together really insightful data and research-driven observations and recommendations about how countries should handle the COVID-19 situation. So with that, I will ask Valeria to share her screen.
So as I was just trying to say, I will just try to emphasize in the two things that we're talking about, which is the food security and then the role that trade has on this. So I just would like to start giving a little bit of a chronology of how you will see the impact of this kind of crisis. So it could be COVID-19 or some other crisis, but specifically for COVID-19, we put together this chronology in which we will kind of split it in three different stages. So in the short term, we will see logistic uncertainty, restrictions, as James just mentioned it, waste, increase of unemployment, and the closing of schools. And the importance of this is the food programs, the feeding programs that they were done in schools that suddenly they just stopped. In the medium term, we will still see problems with employment. We will see a rising problems in the production chain or the value, the global value chain, and then in the supply of inputs that will affect not only now, but it will affect the next harvest. And we're going to start seeing impacts and increases in poverty and problems in food security. That is something that I will emphasize in the next slides. And then in the long term, we will see a global recession and then the possibility of a less nutritious diet. And this is something we will definitely emphasize in this presentation. In addition, the transmission channels of the COVID-19 crisis in the countries, and especially in developing countries, we will see it in a reduction of international trade, in the fall in the prices of primary products, the intensification of risk aversion and the worsening of the global financial institutions, and lower demand for tourist services and reduction of remittances. These last two things, tourism and remittances, are even more important for some developing countries than others. For example, the Caribbean countries, Central America, and some African countries. So summarizing, this crisis can be seen in three stages. You can see it in the impact, in the transmission, and in the mitigation. And it will be very important to do the policy analysis and the prioritization of the policies needed for each of the different stages. They won't be the same, and they will be the same also for different countries. Countries are very heterogeneous, and we will also see of this. So each country will need to figure out what are the best policies for them. Next slide. So I would like just to take you through some slides that hopefully will put us in the context of how global crises of this nature can affect not one country by itself, but also the world. And hopefully we'll leave you with the message that cooperation, collaboration, and transparency is beneficial for all. So the concept that I would like to take you through is risk. So that is, I think, the word that it is one of the most important when we talked about crisis. And for these next slides, one color will indicate one country. Next. So we start with just one plain simple value change in one country. We will have that producers, consumers, and whatever it goes in between them. No? So that is just one value change. Next one, next slide. When we see this, if we look just at the production side, so just the producers, we'll see that the risk they face are given by weather, pests and diseases, and conflicts. Next slide. If we add to this the consumer side, we will see that, that they also have risk by themselves, so that in this case, they can also be affected by COVID-19 by getting sick or by problems in the labor, the unemployment and things like that. And there also becomes some risk in between the transportation, moving the goods from the producer to the consumers. Next slide. So we add here now the consumers. As I said, they can also get sick and have their other problems. And then the next one. In this case, now we're adding trade. So we're adding the other countries. So now we can see that there are different colors. Remember, so on the producer side, we can see that maybe the country that represents the orange will only have some weather problems. But then the other two countries that go below, it also have some pests. So you can see there that now when we get a bigger number of producers, the risk that we get from pests, it will decrease. Okay, next one. And now we add other countries as well. We also have the crossing the borders. So this crossing the borders can also ask some risk in the transportation and in the logistics of getting to one place to the other. But as well, it will have, it will be one important thing that it will diversify the system. So it means less risky at the end when you add more countries into this. Next one. So as you can see now, value chains become definitely more complex, and not only more complex, they increase the value added, they increase the number of employment we have of that, the number of services we need for this, etc. But also it improves nutrition. This brings me to the next slide. So now we have a more complete, it's more complex, but as well it's more complete. And it will allow us to have more diet diversification between countries. So you have the seasonal thing. So for example, I don't know, the US can still eat the blueberries in the opposite season because they import blueberries from Argentina or Chile. But also some countries, for example, in Central America can have access to these blueberries that otherwise they couldn't, which they are very good in terms of nutrients and fiber and other things, which it will increase or get better the nutrition of that particular country. The next slide. And then what I would like to emphasize here is that having a more complex food system doesn't mean that it's worse. It's actually safer. But the key thing here is to really harmonize and make sure that we have the proper regulations to keep it. So we have the codex system that is under the WTO, and we can talk about a little bit more about this. And then just to finish with these kind of slides, I would like just to leave you with the message that how coordination, collaboration, harmonization, and transparency between countries is key in having an efficient and safe food system, and it becomes even more relevant in situations of crisis. So this goes to what James told you about restrictions, export restrictions that we will also, I will show you some numbers later on, but that's something that they tend to do countries when they face crisis, when in reality they need to understand that a better collaboration, it will actually help all consumers and producers around the world. For this, one thing that it is very important is the role of the G20, as well as the WTO and the AMIS system, as James also mentioned it before. I'm going to start giving you a lot of information, and because I already took some minutes at the beginning, I would like to just make sure that you know that at the end of this presentation, I will have 3 slides of just references with a hyperlink of all the things I am mentioning right now. And as well, in the folder that we have for the e-class, I included there some references that are also going to be very helpful in getting all the background information and presented in this PowerPoint. And of course, that the questions at the end are more than welcome. Okay. So, this will bring us back to the topic of trade and the effects of COVID-19. So its impacts will affect both supply and demand channels, but will be felt different times. They will affect all the elements of the food system, from the primary supply to transformation, commerce, as well as national and international logistics systems, to intermediate and final demand. It also affects the factor markets, namely labor and capital markets, and also the intermediate production inputs, which will be key. So we already talked about the stages of the crisis, and I would just like to highlight the connection that rises between health problems with the economic crisis, the food crisis, which is what differentiates this crisis from previous ones, that this connection occurs through generalized economic crisis, so interruptions in the supply of goods and panics by the consumers. But again, in this crisis, everybody loses, which is a little bit different as well than previous crises, which maybe some countries were not affected as much, and some sectors as well. In this one, everybody will lose, and we will go over that. So these are just some examples. But before we go into the next slide, I would like to answer two questions. So we can, sorry, Narcisa, but if you can just do the poll right now, so that it will give us an idea of what you think about. So Narcisa is going to put up a poll in which you will need to answer two questions. One is just, the first one is just a yes or no question. And the other one, you will need to decide which region will be, you think it will be more affected by COVID.
So Nargisa, I can do the poll. Oh, good. Sorry.
Sorry, thank you. Brent, you're muted, but if we're ready.
Sorry, yeah, so I think we're ready. I think most people have responded.
Perfect.
Can you see the poll results?
I cannot.
Okay, I can read those to you.
Thank you so much.
Have you observed or read about food supply disruptions due to COVID-19? 93% have said yes, and 7% have said no. Your second question, which region of the world do you think will be most affected by the crisis? 45% say Africa, 16% say Asia, 15% say Latin America, 24% say developed countries. Good,
excellent. Very good. Just keep that information in mind for the next slides that we are going to talk about. So at IFPRI, we used a global general equilibrium model, which is called MiragroDEP. And again, all the literature from that model, we can find it in the IFPRI website. And what we found is that we designed an scenario of COVID-19 with all the things I mentioned before. So we included the impact of social distancing, the increase in the logistic cost, the impact on tourism just because people are not traveling, things with petroleum. So all the things I already mentioned, they are included in this scenario. And what we see is that the crisis brings a global recession, and we can make a difference with other crises. And as I said, in this one, we all lose. So a 5% global recession will increase the number of extreme poor by almost 150 million worldwide.
Excuse me, Valeria?
Yes.
Could you make sure, did you still ask Nargisa to advance the slides?
Yes, yeah. Sorry about that. Perfect, thank you. So this is the slide I was just talking about. So a 5% global recession will increase the number of extreme poor by almost 150 million people worldwide, which is an increase of 20%. Brent also asked me to emphasize a little bit in Latin America, so I will, again, you can have the reference at the end, which is a Tableau table, in which if you go there, you can just get information about all the other regions in the world, and you can even go into specific of what happens in each of the countries related with this exercise of extreme poor people. So if I'm just going to concentrate in a couple of examples here, just because we don't have a lot of time, but if you're interested in looking at other regions of the world, you can just go to the Tableau and get the information by yourself, okay? So Latin America will be no exception, and will have an increase in extreme poverty. Again, the extreme poverty, so the poverty line of $1.9 per day, of around 12%. With Central America being the region with the highest increases of 20%, around 20%. A peculiarity is that in between, within LAC, so Latin America and the Caribbean, it will see greater increases in extreme poverty of the urban population, while South America will see it in rural population. So at higher levels of poverty will also bring food security crisis, which in this case will not be induced by prices per se, like in the crisis of 2007 and 8 that James also mentioned before, but in a food security crisis induced by reduced income. Next slide. So all of the economic crises will be seen in all countries. This contraction will be at different levels, depending on various variables, like the age of population, the measures taken while faced with COVID-19, production structure, and the connection that each of these countries have to the world, how interconnected they are. So looking at the chart, so the top part of this slide, we can see that for developing countries as a group, the economic consequences will lead to a decrease in their aggregate GDP of around 3.6%. But the economies of Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America will be much more affected due to its relatively high dependence on trade of primary exports or basic products. For Latin America, a drop in GDP of almost 6% is estimated, with reductions in household consumption of around 4%, and drops in exports of 30%. In the case of exports from the food industry, there will be a decrease of 2 percentage points less than total exports and a drop in value added of the food sector of almost 4%, which is different than the total. Also looking at the graph, the one just below, we can see that a decrease in global consumption of fruits and vegetables will be seen due to logistic complications and falls in income from all the households, which will indicate a deterioration in the diet rather than increases in the deficits of the calories consumed. And this is a very important message if we're looking at nutrition in developing countries. Next slide. So here what we see is the world markets for now are well supplied with commodity prices that have remained relatively stable, despite the hoarding that we saw at the very beginning of some countries and the imposition of restrictions, again, in some countries for some of the basic products. Quantitative restrictions on exports is one of the causes that created recent volatility in rice and wheat, and those are the ones we see in the graph in gray and yellow, so that we see that all the other ones have kept pretty much the same. This graph comes from AMIS, as James was saying. They have good information and follow the markets of what's going on in the four staples that I just mentioned. So it's wheat, maize, rice, and soybeans, and they keep that information. The only thing we saw was, given some of the panic effects that we saw at the very beginning, there were just some problems with the supply of, for example, eggs or other flour and things like that. But that was not a problem on the supply side, but it was more of the demand side. Next slide. Now, over time, the food chain disruption arise due to the spread of the disease among the workers. There were some labor shortages and weak supply links. So the transportation and logistic costs, air and sea, and there's a difference between them. The air transport costs are on a record high, affecting perishable products, while the maritime transport, so everything that goes in the vessels, has not had major increases in cost. Although we'll have to keep a very good, or at least keep an eye on that, given that now the vessels, the ships are staying, they used to stay just one day in port, and now they have to stay at least 3 days, again, for the cleaning and for other restrictions that they are having. So that will increase the cost of this in the near future, or at least we need to keep an eye on those. But in terms of the air transportation, as I said, is now they are in a high, and it's because all these flights, airplanes, they used to carry passengers, but also fruits and vegetables. And now, because there are no passengers, they are not going to be able to do it. So it's also more expensive to the ones that actually make it. And some countries have also land border cuts. So for example, in the case of Nicaragua and Costa Rica, trucks cannot keep going between those two countries, so that there are some problems with the logistics and short supplies of some things. So given this, and this graph, what it shows is the impact in Latin America will be a contraction in exports and in the real income of producers. with some differences according to country by country and also by product. We can see that fruits and vegetables, oilseeds and fishing for the agricultural sector, and fertilizers and energy products will be those that will be the greatest contractions in Latin America. And again, we have information for other regions if you're interested in. Next slide. This one shows the data on export restrictions and how that affects food importing countries. So, you have this story from the two different countries, the net food exporters and the net food importers. So in general, when they put the restrictions, as James already mentioned, you can have them by quantitative restrictions of just an export tax. Export tax, they are very well, there's a lot of documentation on those and literature review about why countries use them, and in general is to deal with domestic prices, but as well as some fiscal issues because they are easy to tax and to collect that. But in this case, what we saw was some export restrictions in which there's just a prohibition of exporting goods. For this case, for this crisis, the restrictions that we saw, they are definitely way less than in the previous one. And it was more concentrated in some countries. So for example, in Latin America, only Honduras put some for beans and maize, so some kind of beans. But that was the only one seen in Latin America. In terms of Asia, for example, Vietnam was the one that put export restrictions on rice. And that was the only staple that really had an effect in markets and the volatility, but also that people were really getting worried that they were not going to have enough rice, given that Vietnam is 10% of the global trade of that commodity. So in this graph, what I just wanted to show you is not the story from the exporter, but from the importer, because some food importing countries really depend on this in terms of food security. So as you can see there in the graph, it's the share of restriction by imported, but it is seen in terms of calories, not in value, but in calories, so that you can see there the importance of that. And as it says there, only 18 countries have put export restrictions, and some of them are already taking them out. So they're stopped. And again, as James mentioned it, this is something that the WTO hasn't really covered well. The only thing that it says is that if a country would like to put an export restriction or an export tax, they need to notify that they are doing that 30 days in advance. Not all the countries did even this part as well, but it is something that it shows up every time that a new ministerial conference of the WTO is pending. The 12th ministerial conference from the World Trade Organization was supposed to be done this last June, so this month in Kazakhstan, and it has been postponed for next June. But one of the things that is being dealt at the Committee of Agriculture is exactly how to deal with export restrictions. Net food importers would like the net food exporters to do not use this instrument, but the exporter also wants some changes or some diminishing in the import tariffs in exchange, or some kind of agreement with us. But this is for another conversation. So next slide. Okay. So what are the policies needed to avoid food crisis, or what are the policies that we can start thinking now that they need to be imposed in order to deal with this? Is economic stimulus that countries have been using. And again, there's a big difference between developing countries and developed countries. Developed countries do have the resources. Developing countries in general, they have higher also fiscal deficits, and they don't have that luxury. Then the financial support that developing countries will need for this. We need the green lanes, and then we need to make sure we prepare for the new normal, whatever that is. So the responses so far is high-income countries providing massive stimulus. The IMF, the World Bank, and other lending institutions have been giving money to developing countries, especially in Africa. The WTO and the G20 have been doing declarations and tried to deal with this, and they've been trying to ask countries to not use export restrictions to aggravate the situation. In the draft folder, I included the G20 declaration on this, for example, which I thought it was interesting. And then what more? We need to invest in research, we need to eliminate the export bans, and definitely more financial support, because cash will be needed. So we need to make sure that the small producers also, they still have access to credit. And my last slide, which I would like to finish with this. So what comes next? Policies will be needed to mitigate the effects of the crisis. What I want to highlight is that the answers will depend on the specific characteristics of each country. So as I mentioned, the fiscal and monetary space that each of them have, the infrastructure of social programs prior to the crisis, the productive structure of each of them. So what's the importance of the agricultural sector? What are the commodities that they export? If they export minerals, or if they're all dependent, how much they depend on tourism and remittances. And also something important is the level of informality of these economies. This will be key in how to figure out what are the best policies, but also what it will be very important to look at is the recovery trajectory that occurs in each of these countries, which are represented, in the curvature of the recovery trajectory. So this is what we need to really make sure we looked at. So from IFPRI, we are working to try to measure the impact of the crisis and design mitigation strategies for a more efficient and faster recovery, always taking into account the heterogeneity of the countries and the regions. So my final message here that I would like to leave you with is the effect of the crisis will be reflected in reductions in income from point of view of the families and problems in perishable products more than in other staples. These can lead to changes in the food basket consumed, so reducing consumption of fruits, vegetables, meat, dairy products, and instead of that, favor the consumption of cereals, which will bring less diversity and setbacks the fight against malnutrition. So thank you very much. And again, sorry for the mishap at the beginning of the presentation. And as I mentioned, the last 3 slides, I guess I don't know if you want to go over them, are references from the last 3. Yeah, so these are the links, and those are 2 other websites that I think that they are very interested in the way they track. One is all the policies in terms of protection, and then the other one is this hunger map from the WFP, in which you can, there's actually a lot of information. It's not only about conflict, it's about access to food and weather and climate change and many other things that I thought they were very interesting. Thank you.